Hi, good afternoon to the folks on the East Coast, and good morning to those out west. You are listening in to a higher education webinar being offered by Thompson Coburn, a law firm based here in St. Louis, Missouri. Many of you know and listen in regularly to our webinars. How the world has changed since the last time we were on together, which was early March, and we were talking a little bit about COVID-19 and some of the things coming our way. Obviously, a lot has transpired since then. I hope, as sincerely as I can say it, that everyone on the line today is safe, healthy, and that they are enduring their quarantines or self-quarantines as well as can be hoped for. I will start off as usual with a little housekeeping here while other folks are still joining in. The title of today's presentation is Contingency Planning for Distressed Institutions of Higher Education. And this is actually a topic, I'll just say for a minute here, that Craig Dean and Brian and I and some other folks in the industry have all been talking about for some time. And we actually were planning a presentation along these lines already before COVID-19 even hit. But with all the events of the last few weeks and months, we felt like we should accelerate our timetable and try to get to some of this sooner rather than later. For the folks who are on the line who are attorneys, as you know, if you've listened in the past, typically the webinars that are part of our higher education webinar series are always good for some CLE, continuing legal education credit. This is not a CLE certified webinar. This is a special, largely in a panel format, which I'll get to in a few minutes. So I apologize if you were here strictly for the CLE. The good news is we are going to be doing a webinar in a little over a week on April 20th, which is a Monday, to talk about the CARES Act. That will be worked into our standard series format and will be good for CLE. So we hope you'll tune back in for that. If you have any questions during the webcast, you'll see there are some widgets down here at the bottom. You can submit the questions through the Q&A widget. We are trying to be sure to leave time today to have questions at the end. We have 90 minutes allotted together. So you can type those questions in, and then at the conclusion of the presentation, I will moderate the questions and we can throw those out to our panelists and see if we can get some of them answered for you all. There's also a copy of today's slide deck available in the resource widget. We always encourage you to download that and anything else you find there. And I will note there are live links in the presentation that is not uncommon. As those who listen in know, we typically try to provide you with easy access to a number of different resources within our slide decks, and that is certainly the case today. You can find some answers to common technical issues and the help widget. So if you have a problem with the platform, please feel free to check out the help widget and see if maybe that gives you a hand. And then finally, we always have a survey that goes out afterward, and we are deeply appreciative if you take the time to give us feedback in that survey. We're committed to trying to make every webinar better than the one before. I should have put it on that slide. I forgot I had that slide with all the different widgets on it. I mentioned earlier Thompson Coburn. We're a law firm, and I only say that because sometimes I've discovered that folks don't know that. We're pretty large, pushing 400 attorneys now. We're based in St. Louis, but have offices in other places like Chicago and Washington, D.C. In fact, a number of our higher education folks are out in Washington, D.C. I am the chair of the higher education practice, and it's ironic because this is the exact same outfit I'm wearing right now. Like most of you, I assume, I get up every morning despite being on the stay-home order and put on my bow tie and my jacket. I'm also going to be moderating today's presentation. Here are some of the other people who are part of our higher education practice and their smiling faces, but the ones I really want to introduce you to, first of all, Mr. Craig Dean, who is a managing principal at AEG Partners out of Chicago. I've had the great fortune to have known and worked closely with Craig for several years now. And Craig is what you call a turnaround professional. So he spends all of his time working with businesses in a lot of different industry sectors, including higher education, that are stressed or in a period of distress at all different phases. and helps them figure out where the problems are, put together plans, and hopefully emerge from that period of stress or distress as stronger entities and institutions. And Craig, I'm so grateful that you are here on the line today. I know that you have a tremendous amount of wisdom. You've spent your entire career working with organizations that are in difficult places and trying to put together contingency plans and things like that. So thank you for being here and providing your expertise. I also am very glad to be able to introduce to you guys another individual I've had the opportunity to work with a great deal over the years, and that's Mr. Brian Dietz. Brian is with Stifel, a very large, international organization, and he is the head of their education investment banking division. Brian, is focused almost entirely on the education and training industries, and has done a tremendous amount. Again, I've worked with him over the years with institutions going through different types of transactions, whether that be some sort of sale or merger or acquisition or institutional integration, and runs the whole process from soup to nuts. So has a very strong sense as to what an institution that is either looking to merge into another or that is looking potentially to develop a partnership, and I won't use the word acquire, but maybe identify and integrate a smaller institution that may be in a place of distress, how to run that entire process, how to start it, how to identify those partners, and get all the way across the finish line. And for those of you who may include some sort of transactional concept in your contingency planning, Brian will have a lot to say today that I know will be of great interest. So Brian, thank you to you and to Craig for being here. The objective here was to get folks on the line who could really offer a lot of meaningful thought, and I have no doubt that will be the case. So here's a quick overview. This is what we're going to do today. I'm going to tee things up very, very briefly because I want to get to Craig and Brian as soon as possible, but just to sort of set the stage. And then we are going to have just a couple of minutes where we're going to talk about the CARES Act. I and my colleague Scott Goldschmidt actually is going to make a guest appearance here, a cameo as it were. Scott's in our practice, was formerly the Deputy General Counsel at Catholic University and has been one of the folks leading our response for our clients, higher education clients, around the CARES Act. I mentioned we're going to do a separate webinar on the CARES Act in a week and change where we're going to really get into the depth on a lot of the programs. That is not the focus of today's discussion, but any institution, whether you are stressed, distressed, or doing great, certainly if you're involved in any kind of strategic contingency planning, accessing the funds available right now pursuant to the CARES Act is an important consideration. And it's certainly not the entirety of your contingency planning, but it ought to be part of it. So we wanted to at least dedicate a few minutes to highlighting some of the things that are out there, and Scott will do that. And then we're going to move to the panel discussion, and we're going to sort of cover it in three parts: restructuring, the transaction alternative, and then lastly, a little conversation around orderly closure. So things moving along crisply here. Let's talk about difficult times in higher education. Our practice had an article that we published on our blog about a week and a half ago. And this title here you see, it's, is there a silver lining for higher education? And we talked in that article about the fact that higher ed has not been thrust into a period of difficulty as a consequence of COVID-19. The challenging reality is, or the unfortunate reality is, much of higher education has already been trying to figure out how to transition over the last 4 or 5 years through a period for many institutions of, if not financial difficulty, at least leaner times, right? And this has been the consequence of a lot of different factors: declining enrollment starting in about 2012 to present, increasing debt for a lot of institutions, increasing challenge in servicing debt that may have been taken on between, say, 2007 and 2012, when a lot of schools saw enrollments increase and were building out and, adding programs and buildings and doing things along those lines, not necessarily anticipating a decrease in enrollments on the other side of 2012. A lot of tuition discounting has, reduced revenues, which makes it more difficult, of course, to service debt. Regulatory burden and inconsistency has plagued higher education. like healthcare, like energy, like a lot of other industries. It is a great challenge, as you all on the line know, when administrations completely change course or when regulations get challenged and overturned and implementation deadlines come and go. You guys are spending a tremendous amount of effort and money trying to understand what you're supposed to do, and unfortunately, in some cases, coming into compliance only to have to scrap the entire infrastructure you just put into place. Certainly, that has not helped. At times, poor management. There's been some culture shift around higher education and the value of a degree. I think sometimes that's overstated, but there is at least some increased discussion around that and what students or individuals really need to make it into the workplace. Changing student demographics, particularly in some parts of the country. New England, the Northeast is a great example where the number of college-age going individuals has just been decreasing over time. And finally, there's been some international student decline. Still lots of international students that come to the United States. And understandably, I'm one of those that thinks we have the greatest higher education system in the world. But there has been some decline for lots of different reasons in recent years, and certainly COVID-19 has impacted and likely will impact those numbers. So the silver lining that we talked about in the article, you know, the last time enrollments in the United States surged was immediately following the 2007 financial crisis. During that period, the unemployment rate went from 4.7 in October 07 to 10% over that 2 years in October 2009, and it would actually stay above 9% through 2011. I mean, you guys who are old enough, most of you who would be on this call certainly remember this quite clearly. According to the National Center of Education Statistics, total undergraduate enrollments over that same period went from 13.7 million in 07 to 15.3 million in 2009. It peaked at 15.9 million the following year. So the data, it doesn't just indicate a correlation between unemployment and enrollment. It also suggests that the impact was immediate. 2 million additional students, right, between 07 and 09, starting almost immediately, and it was significant. Here's a little chart. So what we did, we created this, the blue line down at the bottom is the national unemployment rate, right? And you can see in 07, right, the unemployment rate spiked up till, 2010 when it started to gradually come back down. The upper line there you see is undergraduate enrollments based on NCES, and there's an obvious correlation between these two curves. So our hypothesis was, with the unemployment rate spiking right now and likely continuing to go up over the coming months, there may be some reason to believe, at least for higher education, that you will see an increase in enrollments down the line. But, and this is a big but, there's a catch. Schools have to be able to stay open and stable over the coming months if they're going to take advantage of that, right? And that's a huge catch, and we understand it. And what that means is institutions are going to have to figure out a way through contingency planning and other means to bridge the gap. In fact, we even have a client who's referring to this period as the bridge, and their strategy, this is a higher education client institution that is referring to their entire strategy as sort of the bridge strategy, with the understanding that there will be another side to all of this, but you've got to have a way to get there. Which brings us to this whole conversation, because we understand for schools that are stressed or in distress, and we talk about this in that article that we wrote last week, and I invite you all to read it if you have time, but we talk about the fact that higher education has at times struggled in the past with this kind of contingency planning. There are a lot of reasons for that, right? Among them, and this is not even not a knock in the least on higher ed, this is a challenge for a lot of different folks, a lot of different industries, even experienced executives, fantastic boards. Nobody has gone through anything like COVID-19, right? This is, for anyone who's alive right now, for the most part, going to be a first-time experience and hopefully a last-time experience. But many seasoned executives and board members also don't have experience with distressed institutions, sort of financial contingency type planning, because they may never have been at an organization that has experienced this kind of period. So we appreciate that among the many reasons that this is a challenge for higher ed is simply that for a lot of schools and leaders and boards, it's an issue of first impression. So we wanted, for those of you who may be finding yourself in that position, who may be having meetings, this afternoon, tomorrow, next week, to try to figure out your planning, we wanted to give you a framework and have some real meaningful conversation around that. I have talked with folks in the past, including the gentleman on the line and many others, and for me, when I talk with schools about contingency planning, and for better or for worse, we've worked with a lot of institutions over the last 4 or 5 years who've been in this situation, we tend to suggest that contingency planning ought to include sort of 3 primary elements. And I'm sure there are other things. This is obviously operating at a high level here. But the first is restructuring. And what I mean by that in the broadest sense is any kind of internal, I don't mean in court, so we're not talking about bankruptcy or receiverships, though we may touch on that later. But we just mean internal out-of-court actions that the institution would take to significantly modify either its debt, its operations. So this is human resources, this is your programming, this is athletics, anything about your institution. This is the internal changes that you would make as a way of limiting financial harm, improving the business, or potentially preparing for a transaction. And right now, we mentioned that would include, of course, understanding access to the funds that you may have under the CARES Act. The second sort of piece, and these are not mutually exclusive. Our suggestion is your contingency planning ought to include all of these tracks. And we're not saying that you should be making decisions necessarily to restructure or pursue a transaction or pursue a closure. What we're saying is the planning process should include all of these concepts, right? So the second would be the transaction alternative. And this would be whether an option, if you are truly stressed or distressed, whether an option would be merging with a financially stronger institution, college, university, or other system. Another option is to sell substantially all of your assets into that institution, and that may still look like an institutional integration to the public, but those from a legal perspective potentially would be organized a little bit differently. There are some schools that have been failing that have been taking pieces, say their nursing program or a law school that's affiliated with the institution, and moving that to another college or university, even though the enterprise as a whole that is closing is still going to close down. And it could mean an investment from another institution or third party. And then finally, the orderly closure. And that concept should always be part of contingency planning. If you are acknowledging as an institution that you are in a place of distress, certainly you should at least be considering what an orderly closure would look like, the timeline, who potential partners would be, those kinds of things. So these are the 3 big buckets, and this is what we're largely going to talk about with our panelists here. In 5 minutes or less, we are going to quickly go through the CARES Act. I will also note we have 2 blog posts out on our blog where we talk about CARES Act provisions that are specific to higher ed and those that are not specific to higher ed but relevant to higher ed. If you want more detail, those are out there right now, and you're welcome to go look at them. I'm going to ask Scott Goldschmidt then to just quickly run us through, we've got 3 slides here, the major elements of the CARES Act that you should be looking out for, that should be part of your conversations, and in particular to highlight the 2 where application processes are already open. So Scott, I'm going to let you take over here, and just let me know when you're ready for me to flip the slide.
Sure will. Thanks, Aaron, and hello to everyone. It's a pretty tall order to get through the entire CARES Act in less than 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. And just so you know, as Aaron said, this is explained in a little more detail in our blog post. This is just to really give the audience an idea of what should be there and what you might be thinking about. So I'm going to go broadly through 4 different areas of the CARES Act: the Higher Education Stabilization Fund, any potential loans available, regulatory relief, and tax relief. So the first on our slide is the Education Stabilization Fund. That's a $30.7 billion program, about $14 billion of which is allocated to higher education. There's various formulas about how that money is distributed, but the weight of that money goes to students with Pell Grants. The language about how the money can be used is fairly broad. Half needs to go to students for emergency financial aid and relief to them, half to institutions to cover any costs associated with changes due to COVID-19. We're expecting the Department of Ed to come out with regulations that further explain and restrict what schools can do, but for the most part, this is the broad language that we're working with and institutions might be planning with.
And Scott, Scott,
yeah.
Let me just ask, to be clear, for the
Sure.
Education Stabilization Fund, this is not something that, to our knowledge, institutions have to apply for. This is something that the Department of Education, pursuant to the statutory formula, is going to distribute, correct?
Correct. That's our understanding. So institutions would get both pots of money, the 50% for the institution and the 50% for the students, and then allocated as such. Our best intel is that the funds will be distributed anywhere, best case scenario in 1 month, worst case scenario in 3 months, just because the department has not set up for this and needs to administratively figure out how to allocate this money. The American Council on Education has come up with a fairly helpful simulation to estimate what schools are getting. This is by no means a guarantee, but if schools are curious about a fairly methodical and thought out projection, I encourage you to look at that. And there's still an open question about how the funds will be overseen, about whether the department will institute regulations immediately, or they will give its educations broadly. The second bucket of things to talk about are the different loan options, some of the loan options that higher education institutions may want to apply for. The first is the SBA loans, the Small Business Administration loans. The Paycheck Protection Program is the most talked about and probably the most advantageous. Businesses and nonprofits with less than 500 employees can apply for a forgivable loan. This application is already out there, and the department, the Small Business Administration has already issued an interim final rule about just to kind of explain so we have a little more understanding of this program. It's important to note that the department has said that the money is first come, first serve. So to the extent that you might be interested and you are kind of waiting, we encourage you to go talk to your relationship bank immediately and put in an application because the money is finite and there will not be enough to go around, likely. Next slide, please. The second of the SBA loans is the Economic Industry Disaster Loan. This is not a forgivable loan, but it gives the option to have funds at advantageous rates. It's important to note that when you are applying for this loan, if you're eligible, schools can receive a $10,000 emergency grant cash advance that does not need to be repaid, but for the actual loan above that amount, it needs to be repaid. Schools can apply for both the Paycheck Protection and Economic Disaster loans. And the last is the Assistance for Mid-Sized Business Loans. So for schools that may not be eligible for the SBA loans, the CARES Act also allocates a pot of money for schools that can be used at a low interest rate. Important to note here that there's some certifications that schools need to make in order to get these loans. That's all part of the Act. But in case the Paycheck Protection or the Economic Industry Disaster Loan would not be available to your school, important to look at this Department of the Treasury loan. Next slide, please. I'm okay on time. Running really quickly, the third bucket of things that we want to discuss is regulatory relief. So the Act goes through a number of different higher education specific flexibilities that the department has, that Congress has enacted and the department has started to promulgate regulations on. So important regulatory relief regards Title IX and return of Title IV and return of Title IV funding, withdrawals, satisfactory academic progress, campus aid waivers. These can be certainly a part of your strategy in terms of relief packages, and it's important to get your campus financial aid professionals to understand this relief so that you can take advantage of it as possible. And so the last bucket is tax relief. And so there are important things like the employee retention payroll credits, deferral of employee payroll taxes, deferral of self-employment taxes, net operating limits, and business interest deductions that your financial professionals might want to take a look at and use as part of your planning strategy. We also mentioned the charitable giving slide here. For colleges, one of the important things is the Act permits $300 of charitable giving to institutions, even if you use a standard deduction and don't itemize. So to the extent that people might want to make a donation to the college and don't itemize, they do already. So with that, I think I maybe went a minute over, but hopefully that was just the broadest of broad overviews to get everyone thinking about what the CARES Act might offer. And to be aware, the fourth iteration of the CARES Act is being negotiated now, so be on the lookout for more potential relief and options for businesses.
Thank you, Scott. And as folks know, the Department of Ed also has been putting out guidance, some of which relates to some of the regulatory relief and the questions around return of Title IV fund and SAP and things along those lines, for the work study, et cetera. Okay, so with all of that said, let's move on to the panel conversation. So Craig and Brian, again, thank you so much for being here, for putting up with that introductory information, and the rest of our time here is going to be allocated to you guys. Craig, I'm going to start with the restructuring piece, and we talked about sort of broadly what we mean by that. That's pretty much anything you might do at the institution. But as a starting point, say here on the screen at a high level, can you help us get a slightly better understanding when, I gave this very 40,000-foot concept with a little more detail. What are we talking about when we say out-of-court restructuring and in-court restructuring?
Sure, and thanks, Aaron, for inviting us to be part of this today, and hello to everybody who's listening. Just to give a framework for this at a fairly high level, an out-of-court restructuring is really something where creditors are supporting the company conceptually, or the school consensually, and that is usually through a negotiation. But key to that is typically management has put together a viable restructuring plan that the constituents of the school can look at it and say, that's a better alternative for me than some of the other alternatives that are out there, such as the in-court options that we'll discuss in a minute. The benefits to this are it's informal, it's generally less costly. If you can rally the constituents, and not all constituencies are easy to do, some are harder than others, but if there's a limited number of lenders, for example, to the school, it can go more quickly and, as I said, more efficiently. The downside to this is if the school is extended with its creditor base, it doesn't really have any protection to solve that problem, and all that is subject to negotiation or creditors taking legal action against the school if it's pursued that, if it's been pushed that far. This, by contrast, the in-court part is exactly what it sounds like, a process overseen by a court. And I think it's important to look at this as really more of a tool than it's not a strategy. But the things you've no doubt heard about at Chapter 11, which has a lot of limitations in the education space, or a receivership, are probably the two most likely alternatives. It is overseen by a court. There's some nice benefits there with regard to the creditor base for the school, because there's an automatic stay that goes into place, that those obligations can be handled in an orderly fashion, in a fair fashion for all those different creditors based on where the school performance is at a time. There's also the opportunity often to, and this is, there's some variation in state law if it's a receivership, but an ability to reject contracts that are underwater or uneconomic, or reject leases that fit that same criteria. Typically, it's more expensive, it's more time consuming, but it can facilitate a sale where a lot of those obligations of the school will be left behind, and that the buyer doesn't have to pick those up. So high level, I think an out-of-court restructuring, if that's an option, is always preferred. It is certainly more efficient, it's more timely, doesn't have the complications of going to court, but there are times that that applies, and particularly, I think we'll touch on it a little bit later, but particularly receiverships to help facilitate a sale of a school.
So, Craig, I mean, we talked about earlier, obviously, one of the first things schools are going to want to do if they, right now, is to find out what sort of resources may be available under the CARES Act. But focusing here on the out-of-court restructuring, and as you noted, we'll discuss a little later the ideas around receiverships or theoretically bankruptcy, although as you noted, and as many on the line probably are aware, those are limited options for institutions of higher education, and it can be extremely difficult to be successful, right? If your ultimate goal is to continue to operate as an institution of higher education, or even to successfully transition through a transaction, it's very challenging for higher ed in the regulated environment to operate through, not impossible, but very challenging to operate through an in-court scenario. But out of court restructuring, so there are a lot of options there, and I assume that those options and what administrations and boards should be considering will vary depending on just how stressed they are, right? I mean, are they just now seeing signs of stress and thinking that coming months could be difficult, or do they literally have creditors at the door? They were already in a very difficult place, and this has put them on the precipice, right? So I could see that among folks listening or viewing this webinar, they could be in very different places. So my question to you is, thinking about at least these two groups, folks who are sort of beginning to see stress and folks who may be really on the precipice with creditors at the door, what are some of the options that they should be focused on?
Thanks. There's a lot of different options, really, although it doesn't always feel that way when you get into these situations. Fundamentally, you're really just trying to match up the ability of the school to generate revenues with its expense base. Easier said than done, for sure. But it usually starts with a diagnostic tool. Probably most folks on this call have heard of 13-week cash flows, which is usually a way to just look at a very detailed, granular basis and kind of what's coming in, what's going out from a cash basis. But being able to look at that helps determine what kind of runway you have before you. There's got to be realistic assumptions about enrollment and tuition dollars and things like that to make that a valuable tool. But it's a rolling tool that gets provides pretty good visibility that way, at least in that short run over the 13-week period, and that'll help inform what kind of strategies are available to a company. Or to a school. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But it really is critical that that visibility is available, that people have questioned all the assumptions around that all the expenses are laid out in a fashion so you can figure out what things might be able to be changed and what may not be able to be changed. And again, that probably is going to determine which sort of options a school has in front of it. But great way to examine all the aspects of the school. It's a great way to get, when somebody's bringing outside advisors in to help with that process, to get up to speed very, very quickly on the operations without having all the history necessarily with the school. Some of it speaks to how you deliver services, how you deliver classes, how you deliver to the student constituents. Some of it speaks to how you operate. But I think, some of those things that I just are worth highlighting here. Certainly, working with a lender, the cash flow demands of a loan agreement or bonds or something like that. Often that can be restructured if there's a good underlying plan associated with that. And the alternatives are not attractive for the lender. And in this environment that we're in right now with the backdrop of everything that's going on with COVID-19 and the economy, I think lenders, surprisingly, are actually more amenable to working with an institution on a viable plan than they may otherwise be, because the alternative is usually pretty unattractive. So that's certainly a key area. But again, it needs an underlying plan. We talked about consensual restructurings, and that's certainly a good one. But I think probably first of all is looking at the actual expenditures of the institution. What opportunities are there to reduce expenses, streamline operations? That might be, if the school is very decentralized, maybe that's fewer resources at each campus in a certain area, in accounting or in enrollment or something like that. You really have to look at that from can some of those opportunities or some of those jobs be combined or partially combined? Obviously, being people-intensive institutions, a lot of any cost rationalization really needs to look at the number at people expense, and is there a more efficient way to deliver what the school is delivering, combine programs, things of that nature. And there's also things that might be a little more generic around changing 401k matches, reducing or adjusting benefits, things of that. They're tough decisions. They're difficult. They involve, people's lives. But I think when looking at the larger objective of can the institution survive and get through the period of stress, sometimes those tough decisions are exactly the medicine that we need to take. Working capital management becomes very important. Sometimes we were working with a school recently that really it was just a timing. They were well within the regulations, but they were paying out certain payments, reimbursements to students a lot sooner than they were required to do so. They were still planning on making the payments. They still made the payments, but they had a little more elbow room to do that. And it had a significant impact on the school's cash flow. So there could be opportunities like that that don't fundamentally change how you operate, but just address timing issues. And then some of the bigger decisions to be made about closing different campus closures, that sort of thing. Obviously, that has some cost implications to it, to go through structured teach-out, that sort of thing. I'd also look at the assets that the school has. There may be opportunities to monetize real estate, land, things like that through a sale or sale leaseback if it's in active use by the school and should be going forward. And if there's enough runway, looking at a merger partner for the school that might give it the right proper financial underpinnings for the long term may also be a good option here. But of course, that requires time. So again, going back to where we started, how much runway is there? How much runway can you create in that interim period? And then what are the options that are viable based on that realistic runway?
Great advice. Great advice. So you've just outlined in a really nice way, Craig, and sort of holistically this idea of what restructuring is really about, and the big buckets where even within the restructuring sort of vertical, the things that institutions should be looking at and thinking through. The question here is, even driving a little deeper, if you were brought in tomorrow, hypothetically, or a restructuring professional, whatever, if the school has a meeting this afternoon or tomorrow, what would the first question be that you would ask? What is the information you would want to see right away? And what do you think would be the most critical problem to solve? Now, we've already discussed that's going to change a little bit, obviously, depending on the institution. And you suggested in your prior comments that maybe some sort of reliable cash flow projection. I assume you would want to know something about debt. But what in those first few hours, if schools get off this call and say we need to have a meeting, what is it they should be outlining?
Well, it might sound like a broken record here, Aaron, but I do think it is, the first thing that whenever we step into one of these situations, is trying to understand the true, not just the cash flow, but the true liquidity situation of the company, what's coming in, what's going out, and looking at that realistically. I think one of the problems that we often find, that's one piece of it, but if you look at the inflows, if you look at the assumptions around, what actually is going to happen on the top line, that's where I think schools and lots of organizations, not limited to schools, often deceive themselves. It's if we make these couple of moves here and here, our enrollment trend's going to change, or the portion of our tuition dollars that we collect is going to move up, and it's going to move up very quickly. Trends are very, very difficult to change, and change quickly. And so what we do, besides looking at liquidity, is often looking at what do those trends tell us, so we can really look at that, how challenging is a decline in those numbers, for example, going to be to stabilize and then turn it around.
And you used an interesting phrase. You said, organizations often deceive themselves. I'm just curious, in your experience, how important is it to be mindful of taking off the rose-colored glasses? And is it your experience that is often an obstacle for organizations?
It is. I think a lot of times because school leaders are good at doing what they know how to do. They're good at delivering their mission. They're good at leading an institution of higher learning in those contexts, but they aren't necessarily used to working in a cash-constrained environment. They're not yet necessarily used to working in an environment where some of the key indicators and key performance measures are declining. And so you do get into this mentality that I've been focused on a strategy. I know it's going to work. I've built this team of high-quality people, and if we just give it more time, if we just get more money from the bank, if we just do these things, we will reach that. Everything will be fine. And typically, it's much more fundamental than that, and much more work needs to be done around challenging that thought process, challenging how quickly things can actually change in pursuing that strategy. There's a reason it's not working. Some of that might be macro factors without a doubt, but that's still a set of factors that are critical to looking at how quickly you can change those, the trajectory of those different performance indicators as you work through putting a plan together and thinking about the contingencies from that perspective. So it's hard to change that mindset, and oftentimes it's just the human. I've got my strategy. I believe in our mission. We're going down this direction, and not reading the science that's saying this is not working. The evidence is there.
Yeah.
Because the dollars aren't flowing in, that it's not going to be viable as the school goes forward, or it's not going to turn as quickly as management would hope in those situations. But the old saw about not managing from hope, it really needs to be based on challenging the assumptions, thinking through those, and looking at probably multiple sets of contingencies.
Yeah. And I'll just add, I think one of the things about higher education that is particularly challenging is, the fact that a lot of institutions have faculty and staff, including at the highest levels, and board members who are alumni. And I think it's very hard. I mean, these are individuals who are so supportive of and committed to their institutions, but when you find yourself in this situation, being faced with potentially stripping some of that away and making very difficult decisions, I think it can be doubly difficult. Because it's a real conflict of interest to some extent, for individuals who so love their schools and don't want to have to make any kind of cut or make any hard decisions that might, somehow reduce the organization that they've known and loved for so long. So I just think that's an added wrinkle in higher ed that makes it even harder sometimes to engage in a realistic assessment. So to what extent,
Aaron, I would just add.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Well, Aaron, I would just add, a lot of times too, COVID's a unique situation because it's happening fairly abruptly. But a lot of times when institutions run into these issues, it's, the enrollment just came in a little bit less than we kind of hoped for this last period, and then a little bit less and a little bit less. And so it's not often it's a dramatic event-driven thing that results in we have to take action. It's like, getting eaten alive by ducks, right? You're getting nibbled to death until you find yourself in a situation where you kind of look around and say, how did I end up here?
Yeah, it's incremental. Yeah, it's incremental. I like the getting eaten alive by ducks. I've not heard that one. That's a Stiefel saying, I assume.
It goes with everything we do.
That's right. It's on your logo. The bear, the bull, and the duck. Hey, Craig, so to what extent, if any, does your fundamental approach, you've everything you've sort of described, and you've been kind enough to obviously take into account very specifically higher education, but what complicating factors exist for an institution of higher ed that's trying to implement a restructuring strategy like this that do not typically exist in your experience for unregulated entities?
Yeah, great question, because there's a lot of those, and I think just kind of piling on what you and Brian were talking about. I mean, I think schools are probably one of the most difficult organizations to run and to lead even in healthy, positive environments. There's more constituents between students and donors and alumni and faculty and staff, and you can keep going down the list, but much more complex just in the structure of the organization from the starting point. On top of that, it's certainly a very people-intensive institution. As we talked about, you've got a lot of different classes of employees within that are, not necessarily thinking the same way about what's being done. A lot of the schools have very highly decentralized structures, so it's harder to be able to move quickly in those environments and move all the organization together at the same time. And probably the toughest thing that we run across is just you're in a regulatory and accrediting environment that just doesn't allow for very quick movement. So at the end of the day, the trying to say, look, this programming course is not working. You can't just say, well, we're not going to do that tomorrow, or this campus is underperforming, we're just going to close it. And you can't necessarily just do that tomorrow. It takes time to get approval for those things. It takes time to be able to execute those things, to execute on a teach out. It is really very constraining and creates a cost of the restructuring, even if it's the right thing to do, that is much more challenging, I think, than if you were, a service or manufacturing company in a non-regulated environment. So that's probably trying to cut expenses in line with revenues quickly is probably one of the biggest challenges that exist in this environment. And then, you know, as you said, each school is unique, so they have a unique set of challenges in and of themselves around the constituents that they work for, the alumni and donor base that they work with, and so forth. But there's definitely some themes there that make these a restructuring and an out-of-court restructuring more challenging. And I think the same thing carries over if you're trying to do some sort of merger that also has many regulatory and accrediting hurdles that can take a lot of time. And we've certainly seen basically quash deals that otherwise would have made a lot of sense.
So I want to, Craig, push us here to the end of the restructuring section because I want to make sure to get to Brian and talk about the transactional alternative. But I did want to ask you this question, and I sort of went back and forth on whether to include it because I didn't want folks on the line to perceive this as an advertisement for Craig Dean. And the reason although I will say here again, I think Craig is great and the best. I've worked with extensively. Hopefully just from the answers, folks understand that this is a guy who really knows his business. But I think it is a fair question. If you are a stressed or distressed institution and you're trying to increase expenses, what is the motivation for installing a restructuring professional? I mean, why do you bring in a Craig Dean in this circumstance, and as opposed to just trying to do things internally?
That's actually a great question, and I think one that schools have to ask themselves in these environments. But I think from a number of different angles, I can address that. First of all, just in general, an orderly restructuring is always better than something that is always less costly, I should say, not just better, but less costly than trying to do it ad hoc, if you will. And so, you know, in our experience, not just with AEG, but I do think it actually ends up being, in the medium term, long term, much more cost effective to bring in people who've been there, done it, tasted it, and been through the process. Restructurings are very time consuming. It can pull your leadership team away from fundamental things that they need to be doing, whereas with a restructuring professional involved, a lot of the work and the questions and the trying to put together the tactics that go along with this doesn't need to pull everybody out of the things that they need to focus on fundamentally in their job, whether that's admissions or, you know, some other key part of what needs to be executed well in a difficult environment. I think there's also, you know, just tactically understanding, you know, how you assess liquidity and put those issues together. Challenging management. We talked about the assumptions that were being made and being realistic about those. Also very important, the communication. Somebody who's experienced in the communications with a lot of the constituents around the table, whether that's talking to what's going to be acceptable to a lender, how do you talk to a creditor that's not going to get paid for a period of time, how do you reach out to students and faculty and things like that. I think there's a lot of help that restructuring professionals can provide on that part, as well as assist, again, from a timing standpoint and the actual execution on some of the initiatives that come out of the restructuring assessment. So I think it's more cost effective in the long run. I think it's more, it doesn't distract the institution from its fundamental mission, and it allows, you know, somebody to be able to take that time-consuming effort, get it with experience, and do it more efficiently.
And I will add that's how we met, actually, was we were representing an institution of higher education, and they had a large investor that actually suggested that they reach out to you. So restructuring's a huge piece of this. One of the objectives of restructuring can be simply to stabilize the institution in and of itself. Another can be to try to put it in the best position possible if it thinks some sort of institutional integration would be a good idea. And I use institutional integration because from a legal perspective, that can be accomplished a lot of ways. Folks often hear attorneys talk about mergers and acquisitions and, how you structure a transaction, whether it's some sort of investment or acquisition of assets or a legal merger. I don't want, for purposes of this conversation, folks to get too hung up on all that. We've talked about that in other webinars and probably will again in the future. But here what we're really talking about is some sort of transaction event that leads you as an institution, if you are stressed or distressed, to essentially integrate into or become affiliated with another stronger institution. So with that set up, Mr. Dietz, institutions that are in this position, one of the threshold challenges it seems like they always face immediately is they say, we think we've got a lot to offer, we've got great facilities, we've got some great and important programs, we've got a lot of great faculty and staff, we're in a tough situation, we need a suitor. How do we find suitable partners?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? You kind of say, okay, you come to that point where you realize that you want to have a conversation with a group. What do you do as the kind of first step? And the first step is maybe just a little step backwards. You have to do that look internally. Things that Craig talked about. Look and say, what do you do well? What are areas that are difficult from an organization? The things that Craig would help pull together, the cash flows, projections, to help you understand what your options are. And one of the biggest ones there is to kind of figure out what your time is. And I know we'll talk more about timing, but that can dictate to a large degree what options you have when you go in there. So in a way, I kind of the first step is the internal look and saying a little bit of the SWOT analysis. Not just on the cost expenses, but on the positive side too. What do we do well? Because then you can start thinking, okay, who could be a good potential fit, with our organization? Who would be a good partner, whether it's strategic or financial? On the strategic side, I think there's things you need to think about, culturally, how would this fit with another organization? Programmatic, is it something that would help another institution from a program standpoint advance in an area, or is it filling a gap like a jigsaw puzzle where it would be complementary and fit nicely with another organization? Same thing with geography. Is it a geography and geographic fit, or are you cost savings potential by being in the same geography and therefore can reduce the number of physical locations in that area? And I think the important thing when you think about the right partner and fit there, a number of important things. But one of the important things is making sure that the equation increases from a total value standpoint. That your organization with another organization is a better organization. 1 + 1 has to be better than 2 to make sure that you're going to be beneficial. And I'm sure. On the strategic side, folks on the phone here in the webinar probably have an idea of institutions they've thought about in the past and said, this would be an interesting combination. There's probably names that pop into their mind and say, these are groups that make sense, from going through some of the things that I mentioned just there. But there's also a number of groups that probably are off people's radars, both strategic and financial, that call myself and yourself and Craig has called us, I'm sure, saying we're looking to expand, and we're in a position of strength right now. We're doing well for whatever reasons, and we're looking to grow in this period, or we're looking to make an acquisition or a merger or find a partner that can help us with X, Y, Z, maybe a capability they don't have. And so there's probably a number of names out there that we know that are just looking for partners that may not be on a list that would come to mind as you kind of think about who would be an interesting fit. So I think that's the kind of the first step is identifying who a potential partner is.
And what do they, even sounds like sort of like you say, sort of categorically what they would look like. So before you come up with specific names, though you might have a short list of those, thinking about, once you do your internal analysis, what kind of institution would be a great fit for us, and it sounds like that will allow you to do a lot of winnowing down right away, right? Because you'll know you can just immediately pull out the ones that aren't good fits for you, again, whether that's geographic or cultural or programmatic or all those different things you named. So assuming a distressed institution has sort of got to that point where it says, okay, we're doing the restructuring, we've got our orderly closure plan, but we really feel like the best possible alternative for us is to sell, all or some of our assets, however we want to structure the transaction, but ultimately to integrate with another institution. You talked about that SWOT analysis, thinking about, what we're good at, but sort of taking the next step, how does that institution determine its value for purposes of negotiating consideration, assuming there would be consideration? Now, you could have a scenario where, an institution donated some portion of its assets, or where a transaction mainly was around the assumption of debt. But assuming there's going to be some consideration, and when nonprofits transact with one another, there has to be a fair market value assessment in there somewhere. How do you do that? How do you determine that value? And does it differ for a nonprofit or a for-profit institution?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And on the value side, how do you determine what something's worth? And so there's, traditional valuation techniques, and for the for-profit side, historically it's been a multiple of an adjusted EBITDA. And, certain schools fall into certain ranges, and certain programs that have high ROIs, have historically done well and a little bit of a premium in terms of a multiple. Healthcare recently has been viewed very favorably, and so those healthcare schools have had a favorable valuation applied to them. But it's usually a multiple off of adjusted EBITDA. Historically, it was trailing or very near-term adjusted EBITDA, and adjustments can be for a number of one-time costs that are really non-recurring, or a campus that's no longer going to be viable and is closed down or in the process of being closed down, so you have this discontinuing operation piece of it. And I'd say you generally get credit for those kind of adjustments. The big adjustment and the big question will be what EBITDA will folks use going forward as a valuation technique, because no one has a good projection right now. Everyone's looking and saying, okay, what does this year look like? And it's really hard to guess that. I think once people do have a little bit better idea of what this year looks like, there will be some kind of corona adjustment associated with it, and I think the market will generally give credit for that. But from a for-profit standpoint, that's typically where the valuation techniques have been. On the nonprofit, you have to look. You can look at some of the multiples and look at comps as well. But I think there you look a little bit more at some of the DCFs and hard asset values. If there are assets, Craig mentioned earlier, some of the hard assets that can be monetized, those have to be incorporated into the total value or the value of what's going with a transaction. And so, make sure that they're getting value from that. But there's a little bit of art and science there, because the science is applying the multiple and running a discounted cash flow analysis to say this is what your cash flows determine your value is. The art side of it comes down to negotiations. And let's say you're merging with an organization, there's a strategic fit, so there's value beyond just handing part of the institution to them. That going forward, there's going to be cost savings or opportunities to grow that weren't there because of, as I mentioned before, the 1+1. Now you have more capabilities, and it's making sure you get credit for that as well as an institution. That not all of that value, so to speak, goes with the party you're integrating with. So the big question is, well, how do you do that? And it comes down to leverage and negotiations, and making sure that you're not in a position of strength, so that you have alternatives, and this goes a little bit to the time, that you're not under any kind of undue pressure under than the normal pressure you're already experiencing. You really want to come down and make sure that you have other alternatives so that you're not in a situation where that's your only option when you're talking to one group or a group.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of transactional work with institutions of higher ed in our practice historically, and certainly in the last 4 or 5 years. And the real uptick has been on the private nonprofit side, where we have seen many more transactions in that space. And I will say, if you have a transaction that only involves proprietary institutions, how you value and structure that transaction, there tends to be a little more flexibility. If you are a private nonprofit or public institution and you are acquiring, you've got to pay real attention to fair market value and certain other concepts when you determine that purchase price. But the good news is there are folks like Stifel and other outfits out there that do valuations. We did a transaction recently with 2 private nonprofits, and they each actually commissioned a fair market valuation of the entity that was being sold, and then they sort of negotiated a purchase price that was informed by those valuations. So are there options other than a full-on merger with another institution? So we talked about this institutional integration. Tell us a little bit about sort of if you're still looking at a transaction, but more along the lines of some sort of strategic investment.
Yeah, well, I'd say options. I think there's a couple things, right? You said a full-on merger or integration with an institution. I don't think it has to be 100% hand over the keys to somebody else. I think there is probably, as you do that introspective look, opportunities to have other pieces of the business potentially sold off. The one thing I would say there is, and the question I get sometimes is, we have this part of our business that the organization has identified that maybe they don't like or like as much or isn't performing well. And so the thought is, if we could just get rid of that one part of the organization that's not doing well, sell that to somebody, we'd be in a better situation. And, the thing I would say to look at when you think about that is, if it's an asset or part of your business that isn't doing well, there's probably not a lot of value there when other people look at it as well. And then if it's an asset that's doing well, for example, or part of the business that's doing well that you're looking maybe to monetize, what is that impact of the organization going to be, longer term, the cash flows and growth of the business, as you go on there. But the other part, and I think, is, can you have an investment come into the business, your school, in the form of debt, equity, minority investment? And I'd say, there's different pools of capital, both for-profit and nonprofit. The nonprofit, it's been a lot of public debt financing, there, and there's opportunities to raise capital, through those means. And on the for-profit, debt historically has been difficult. There's not been a lot of leverage available for-profit schools. We've seen the use of preferred equity, kind of a hybrid between debt and equity, being used more often because of the impact it has to balance sheets and composite scores. And equity, just pure equity investments, have historically looked for control, so they've gone more than 50%. But we've seen, I would say, generally groups, just at a high level, looking at, kind of the impact of COVID, what's happening, and they've kind of fallen into 2 buckets. They kind of say, hey, we're going to sit down and wait and see what happens, and then we'll come back out. And we've had another group, generally of investors, saying, this is a great opportunity for us to make investments, make strategic opportunities out there that we can monetize and help, because we know that will be beneficial for us. And so there are definitely investors right now saying, we know people are going to have a hard time, and we're going to be there because it's a great time to make an investment.
Make a great point around this idea. I spoke earlier about institutional integrations, but it is, I think, worthwhile to put a slightly finer point on that and just say, for example, in our practice, and I know Brian we've worked with you and Craig and others and seen lots of variations. I mean, we've seen a full-on institutional integration where the one of the institutions, it may have been publicly held out as a division after the transaction of the university, but its sort of sole identity or individual identity more or less was gone following the transaction. We've seen, in fact, we're working on a transaction right now where following the transaction, the idea is that the institution that is being, quote, acquired will still be held out and operate as an independent entity, right? And the other stronger, financially more stable institution will become sort of a controlling presence in the background and providing financial and management support. But to that extent, both entities continue to be publicly held out as having completely independent identities, right, and serving their communities in the way that they always have. And then, like you noted, there are examples too where, and we have seen where stressed institutions determined that they couldn't continue in their and be viable as an ongoing enterprise. But I mentioned at the outset, they have a nursing program that's great. So they are taking that entire nursing program and essentially placing it into another college, right? And then they had, say, a law school, and that law school is sort of being picked up and attached to another university and will continue as an independent enterprise. So there are a lot of variations here that should be considered by schools that are in a difficult place right now and are sort of going through this process of contingency planning. And to your point, a big piece of that is understanding where the value is in your core organization and what might really be attractive to a potential suitor. You mentioned time earlier, and my experience in working with you and Craig is that I've learned a lot about time management and how important time is to crisis planning and being successful with the transaction. Can you talk a little bit about that time component?
Yeah, it goes with this regulated industry, and just generally, these processes take time. And when people ask how long does it take, my answer is usually long, and longer than you expect. And there's reasons for that. There's pieces of any kind of transaction, and maybe just put some numbers around it. How long is long? A kind of straightforward transaction you can plan for can take 9 to 12 months. Sometimes shorter. We've done it quicker. If there's been, pure, or really strong financial stress, you can move faster than that. If, other times, depending on who the regulator is, as well as who the party is, and that makes a big, that you're working with, kind of integrate with, can take 18 months or even longer than that as well. So I think the important thing is you try as much as you can to not let time dictate your process. And so to what Craig mentioned earlier, of giving yourself as much runway as possible is really important. In a typical process, you can expect, a couple weeks, maybe 4 weeks or so to kind of get organized, another 4 to 6 weeks to make those initial conversations, share information, really start to find out who's serious and who's not, so you can whittle down the groups that you're talking to. You want to get some kind of letter of intent, get some more definitive discussions and start to work with 1 or 2 parties. That's another 4 to 6 weeks. And then, final documentation and regulatory approval. And Aaron, you could speak to that. Depending on who the regulatory approval is, or if it's needed, can add substantial time to it as well. And so these processes and transactions, do take a lot of time. And it's one of the reasons, I think when you mentioned in the beginning, you look at these, restructuring, transaction, and other options, including, potential closure, you really have to be evaluating all these at the same time, because, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and run out of that important word of time.
Yeah, and I'll only comment that, if you're in an unregulated industry and you're looking to just sell a widget factory to another widget factory, I think that's something that can be accomplished in weeks or a couple of months. In higher education, when people contact me, and they say, we want to do an institutional integration or something like that, we'll quote them 6 to 9 months. And a lot of that is driven by the regulators. I will say, if if higher ed weren't regulated, if the U.S. Department of Education and your accreditors and, all of those guys, let's say theoretically, they either, you didn't have to run their processes or they were willing to run them very quickly. I mean, I think you could, understanding, I should say, that if you have really large organizations that are complex, you can need more ramp-up time just for the operational integration. But, I still think you could get something done in, say, 3 or 4 months. And the only reason I point that out is because I believe that the regulators, including the U.S. Department of Education, the accreditors, are going to have to do some serious self-examination in the coming months and maybe make some decisions around whether or not they want to roll out or offer up expedited approval processes. Because I do believe that we're going to see an increase in the number of stressed and distressed institutions trying to execute transactions and that are essentially communicating that without them, they may not continue to be viable. And so the regulators are going to have to decide, do we want to come up with a way to expedite this process or these processes, or do we want to watch institutions go under because we can't turn applications quickly enough? And, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, by the way. I mean, obviously you don't want schools to go out of business. You don't want their campus communities to be injured. There is a reason that regulators have processes, and they only have so many hands on deck. So, there is a cost to regulators doing away with processes, or overburdening their own people trying to get through things too rapidly. I mean, there's a cost there, and there's some trade-off, and they're just going to have to decide. But I think that rubber is going to hit the road, and if there are some expedited processes that come along, that may actually impact the time with which you can get a transaction accomplished in the higher education environment. I think we sort of talked about this runway, so let me just go to this question, then we can move on to the closure piece, which is the last piece. I'll put to you the same question I put to Craig, right? Because investment bankers and brokers are not free. And the question I'll ask you is, can you talk a little bit about why an institution that right now is struggling might consider reaching out to, Stifel or some other organization to help broker a transaction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say, we're not hourly, so a lot of the conversations are free to start, but there is a fee obviously associated with it. But I think it helps to think about and explore your options and understand what can we really accomplish, what's realistic, what isn't realistic for each individual specific organization. And I think that answer really depends on who you are, what you're trying to accomplish, and what your situation is. And I think, generally, it's helpful, just as Craig said, having someone else there. Transactions, any kind of process, successful or unsuccessful, take time and resources, and having, someone to outsource that to, assist with that, run that process for you who's done it before, I think is helpful. And then I think an important part is when you get into, difficult discussions, negotiations on value, things like that, it's helpful to have that third party, there, give yourself some distance from an organization that you have a broker, investment banker, doing that. And then the last thing I'd say is, when you're engaging in these conversations, if you do have an advisor, it definitely signals the seriousness of the conversations. It's easy to pick up the phone and call another institution saying, hey, maybe we should get together, and wouldn't it be fun if our organizations were together? It's another one to have an investment banker involved because it says we're going to do something, and we're trying to do something, and we're serious about it. So I think that adds to it.
Yeah. And I'll answer. Go ahead,
jump
Craig.
on that, Aaron, too. I think the other key piece to that is, somebody like Brian has his pulse on the market. So seeing a lot of transactions, what's going to be valued by a buyer or a merger partner that perhaps you as the seller may not even have focused on that, and you think it's something else, but it fits in geographically, or it has a different dimension to it that complements the organization that might be the merger partner. So I think having that knowledge really strengthens the process and results in a better outcome.
I agree. And to the folks on the phone who are saying, boy, this just sounds like a bunch of professionals pitching their business, here's what I'll say. You know, first of all, you can't do it on your own. There's no doubt about that. And it may not always make sense to bring folks in, whether that's a lawyer or a turnaround professional or an investment banker. I will say this, for me, it all comes down to time. Having worked over the last several years with institutions that were stressed and distressed, and having understood that we had limited cash flow, that, you know, as things became more difficult, the regulators started to pay more interest, and now we have more reports we have to file. Now we're providing, you know, bi-monthly cash flow statements to the U.S. Department of Education that has concerns about our financial responsibility, potentially wants to restrict our access to Title IV. You know, it all becomes a timing game, and runway becomes so precious. And if you spend weeks or months and you are not making significant, informed, meaningful process towards whatever your contingency plan might be, that could be fatal. I'll just be very blunt. And in my view, the advantage of bringing in professionals early, whether that be someone on this call or not, please understand. I mean, just anybody out there who is informed and capable, but bringing them in early, it means that while you may be paying them, at the same time you are taking action early and acting in a way that is efficient, preserving that runway and using it as efficiently as possible. Lawyers trade stories all the time about getting calls from clients at a point in time when there is almost nothing they can do. And all the time, you know, I'll talk with other folks, say, boy, if those guys had called me and we could have gotten in there 2 months ago, we might have been able to really help them out. And so I would just say, as people are weighing these decisions, in my mind, the critical question is, do you have enough runway and sufficient cash to potentially do things in an inefficient way? And you may. Or are you at a place where you need to be getting it right the first time and as quickly as possible? And I think if it's the latter, then there's an advantage to bringing in folks right away who can help you do that. I've obviously, you know, speak very highly of the folks on the phone, but there are certainly others out there. No disrespect intended, Craig, Brian, or Thompson, Coburn. Hey, the last piece of this, I think, is orderly closure. Most of you, if you are institutions of higher education, actually have a regulatory obligation if you find yourself in a place of financial distress. I mean, it kicks in at a certain point, but there will come a point where you have a regulatory obligation to have a teach-out plan. Your creditor will require it. But I will just argue that as part of any sound, you know, responsible, exercising your fiduciary obligation contingency plan, you need to be thinking about an orderly closure if things don't work out. And some of this will be informed by the same analysis you're already doing, right? I mean, you're figuring out what do we have, what's our cash flow, what's our runway, what are the assets that have value. I mean, all of those things lend themselves in part to your orderly closure plan as well. But I just really want to emphasize, and I know if you call your regulator, they will agree with us on this point, and I think they are absolutely right, this has got to be a component of a responsible contingency planning exercise. So Brian, I'll ask you and Craig both, because we're here in our last couple of questions. How does an institution that is trying to do all of this at once balance the pursuit of a transaction with restructuring efforts and closure planning?
Well, I'll start, and I'll say I think it's important that they're all integrated and communicating. I think that's the key to it. You know, we've you know, been through this before together as a group. We've worked together in other situations. It's communication is key, so that the decisions being made to preserve cash and, you know, for the organization are being communicated with, you know, a banker like myself, and so that, you know, those are, you know, timing and impacts are fully known, so there aren't surprises, you know, with, you know, an institution that maybe, you know, trying to merge with another one or integrate with another one, as well as everyone needs to know what the fallback, you know, option is in the closure there, to make sure that, you know, the reality of, if this doesn't work or something happens, we're going to go down this path is known and upfront.
Yeah, and we would
Craig, I don't know.
go through that, and we would typically go through that analysis with, and it's hard to shift your mentality back and forth between a path that creates a sustainable organization, whether it's independently or with somebody else, and trying to think about the downside analysis. But I think on the downside analysis, orderly closure process, there's a number of decisions that need to be made. There's a process to go through. There's costs associated with that. And, the way we typically look at it is, let's back that up. We need certain milestones to hit along the way on the sustainable path. And if we're not hitting those, we're reviewing, okay, we put the plan B together, the orderly liquidation together. Do we need to turn to that option now? Do we have another, could we have more runway? And I think it's just a necessary discipline in that mode, so you avoid we did everything we could and then just face an abrupt closure and the downside of that for all the constituents that are involved.
And I'll just add, the closure planning is very complex. To your point, Craig, it involves a different set of assumptions around, when you're talking about runway, it's a totally different exercise if the runway is needed to close as opposed to try to get to a transaction. There are the operational considerations and regulatory considerations involved in a closure plan are complex, as are those around various types of legal exposure and liability. So it is a challenging exercise, and another one that should be taken on deliberately and thoughtfully. I've seen some terrible closure planning over the years, to be frank, and I've seen some very good closure planning. And I will just say, it's the old ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? If you spend time on this type of contingency planning, it will be so much better for faculty, staff, and students, for administrators, for board members, for everyone involved, and likely produce a much better outcome from a legal and regulatory exposure standpoint as well. So I'm going to jump real quickly here. I want to get us to questions. I'll just offer, we've got a higher ed webinar series. That's one of the resources we offer. The CARES Act presentation will be, we think, it should go out in a minute here, but I believe it's going to be not this coming Monday, but the Monday after that, right? And then we'll have one action on cannabis and higher ed in May that I know some folks are already talking about. Our webinars are all on demand, including this presentation. So you should be able, as soon as tomorrow, if you want to listen to this again or pass along to somebody else, to do so, and they're free. You just go to the TCLE page and click on it. You can listen at your discretion. Again, if you're looking for CARES Act information or other information, please, you're welcome to visit our blog. And we often do, and I think soon we'll be putting out some tools and materials that are just free and for your use as part of the higher education community. All that being said, on the Q&A. So I'm going to moderate. I will say a number of we got several questions right around when the CARES Act conversation occurred. I actually want to, with all due respect to those folks, I want to put those second. We are going to do that special presentation. I'll see if I can get to those here in a minute, but I want to lead with the questions that really relate to this presentation. So the first is, okay, we're a stable school and feel like this would be a good time for us to grow through acquisition, but we don't know how to find struggling schools or schools that might be potential partners. What's a good place to start? And Brian, you spoke a little bit to this, but maybe you could speak to it a little bit more.
Yeah, no, it's a good thing and it's good to be in that situation. I think you're going to see more hand raising occurring over the next weeks, months, time frame as institutions realize the situation they're in and start looking for a partner there. I'd say counsel, talk to Aaron, talk to myself. Our contact information is there, and we can start filtering and seeing what are the ones that might be a good fit are, because they reach out to us a lot of times there. And, just in your conversations, with organizations, and, I'm sure you have it with other organizations out there that may be having more difficulty. I think you're going to see them starting to raise their hand and start signaling that, we're having a little bit more stress, and, maybe a partnership makes sense.
It's I suspect there will be a bit of a buyer's market emerge in higher education over the next few months. So what happens when an institution of higher education closes? In this case, it says due to financial distress, without having submitted a teach-out or provisional plan. So it sounds like we're talking about a precipitous closure. Is there officer or director liability in that circumstance? Well, I'll just offer up, it's a very complicated question, right? And that's not to punt. It's just to say, when you have a precipitous closure, whether there's legal exposure, regulatory exposure is going to depend a lot, even if it's rapid, depend a lot still on how it's carried out. I mean, you could have a precipitous closure, but it could occur at the end of a term when all Title IV has been earned and paid out. You might have an institution across town that is great, and even though it's precipitous, they immediately reach out to lots of your students and faculty and staff and say, look, we want to bring you on board. We're going to accept students by transfer. You could have all those sort of surrounding conditions, and even though it was a rapid and precipitous closure and there wasn't a formal teach-out plan, you could have a fairly positive outcome given the circumstances. Conversely, you could have an institution that closes midterm, owes return of Title IV liability to the department, so federal funds that need to be paid back, all that tuition that wasn't earned. They may fail to make payroll tax payments depending on whether certain amounts are already earned. I mean, there could be all kinds of legal and regulatory exposure, and it is absolutely the case that some of that, theoretically, could make its way to your officers and your directors. Not always, but it depends on the circumstances. Certainly if there was a belief by the regulators or legal authorities that there may have been fraud involved in the way things were handled in the final days, you could have, officer and director liability. The other thing that can occur is if you have an officer or director of an institution that closes, it can preclude them from, a Title IV participating institution can preclude them from being able to serve in that capacity with another Title IV institution. But look, I'm just going to take a step back here and reiterate what I said at the outset. It's incredibly complex, right? I mean, organizations are different. They're all different sizes and shapes. The anatomy of a closure can differ dramatically based on how the institution that's closing handles its closure, and also how other institutions in the area manage the closure and whether they are able to step up and assist in one way or another. I worked several years ago, had an institution that closed out on the West Coast, and it was not precipitous but close to it, but it was a highly respected institution, and there were lots of schools up and down the coast and actually even into middle America that held this institution in high regard and reached out immediately. And so though it was rapid, we were able to assist a lot of the faculty, staff, and students. Not everybody, but many more than, frankly, a rapid closure like that would have any right to expect. So the landing in that case was much better than we had thought initially that it might be. So that was a lot. If you've got specific questions, you can reach out to your legal counsel or reach out to us.
Aaron?
Yeah, go ahead.
Aaron, I think part of the question was just if they hadn't submitted the teach-out or provisional plan, what's your experience with that? Having some, abrupt closure, yes, but just the fact of not submitting the plan.
I don't think the fact of not submitting the plan is going to make a big difference. I mean, your regulators won't be happy about that. And the reason they have those requirements is, to ensure that that precipitous closures are avoided. But I don't think there will be material additional exposure or liability based on the fact, in my experience, based on the fact that you didn't submit a plan. I think the real exposure and liability is going to be related to the actual closure. And if you don't have a teach-out plan and you haven't done that sort of contingency planning, it may indicate a rougher closure and a faster closure, and that's probably going to increase your exposure and liability. So the fact that you don't have the plan filed, I think is, at least in my mind, less of a concern. There are much bigger fish to fry in that circumstance. Okay, so we've got several other questions. Some of these veer a little more into the CARES Act conversation, but we can go ahead and try to take those on. Let's see. Can schools access tuition protection funds that institutions pay into? It's managed by state regulatory boards for helping with the burden of issuing refunds to students. That's a state-to-state question, but I'll just say typically in my experience, it's not the institution that has access to a tuition recovery fund. Usually that's going to be managed by a state agency, and students are going to apply directly to that state agency for some sort of relief, right? So the state is not going to give the funds to the closing institution to manage, right? Let's see. Can there be specific asks of institutions above and beyond, in the CARES Act? Yeah, I understand this question. So the question is going to when funds are dispersed through the higher education relief fund from that pot of money, would it be possible that the U.S. Department of Education puts additional conditions on the disbursement of those funds? Well, Congress in the CARES Act included some parameters, right? So it said the funds have to be used broadly for certain purposes and can't be used in some cases for these specific other purposes, for example, to build a church or a new football stadium. Could the department layer on additional conditions? I believe that it is within, to some extent, within their regulatory authority. I don't think those additional conditions could be at odds with the statutory language. So, but I think that if they're consistent with that statutory language, they could include some additional conditions. And I think it's fair to say that for all of these programs under the CARES Act for higher ed and other industries, that you can expect these regulatory bodies that are administering the dispersal of funds to try to come up with mechanisms for monitoring where those funds go and ensuring that they're being used in a way that's consistent with the statutory language. And to do that, they're going to have to put some level of condition on the receipt and use of those funds, right? I mean, it may not be the kinds of conditions that we're seeing advocated right now by different individuals in Congress who have particular agendas, but it could be conditions like we got to know where the money goes and you've got to report back to us on how it was used, and, you know, so that we can ensure that even if they don't add on to the statutory language, so they can at least ensure that it was used in a way consistent with that statutory language. So I would expect some additional level, some conditions and reporting and monitoring related requirements to come from these regulated entities. And we can talk more about that when we have the CARES Act webinar in a week and change. So I'm seeing several questions that are really specific to the CARES Act and those different loan programs. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to suggest if folks have CARES Act questions for us that are specific, email them to me, or you can email them to Scott Goldschmidt or really anyone in our practice, and we'll get them to the right place. And we're happy to reach out and try to have those conversations with you all. Thank you so much again, Craig and Brian, for jumping on. I certainly feel like and know that that all of this conversation was very meaningful, and I just appreciate so much you guys making time and lending your expertise and knowledge to this conversation and really creating the conversation. To the folks on the line, thank you for attending. We're always grateful. We hope you found it helpful. Keep a lookout for additional resources from Thompson Coburn. As I mentioned before, we've got stuff on the blog, we've got more coming out, and we've got the CARES Act webinar later here in April. Otherwise, please, please, please be safe, stay inside, try not to jeopardize yourselves or anybody else. We're trying to do the same here at the Lacey household, and it can be tough, but we're all in it together, right? Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.